With a newly leaked Death Guard model showing up on social media recently, it looks as though the mighty Plagued Ones will be getting some love in the very near future. And so, what better time to run through their index whilst it is still current and take a look at their rules, their datasheets, and their stratagems in 10th edition. Now, we're not going to go through their new Grotmus detachment in a huge amount of detail because there has already been a video that I did on that I will link down in the description. But let's get started right away. And first up, of course, is their army rule, which is called Nurgle's Gift. This rule gives your units an aura, which is called your contagion range. And whilst an enemy unit is within that aura, it gets a debuff, as well as some further effects from some of your abilities, your stratagems, and enhancements, and that sort of thing. But the main core part of this rule is that they get -1 to their toughness if they are within contagion range. And this aura grows over the battle. It starts relatively small at just 3 inches, but then it expands to a 6-inch aura in battle round 2, and then from battle round 3 onwards, it gets bumped up to a actually rather nice 9-inch aura. So between all of your units, you can cover a lot of the board, and certainly by the mid and end game, anytime you are in some important combat or fighting over an objective, it is very, very likely that the enemy is going to be sitting at -1 to their toughness, so it can be quite a big deal. The -1 toughness effect itself is a really good one. It may not seem super exciting, but dropping Marines to toughness 3, Guardsmen to toughness 2, even bigger things like tanks and monsters going from toughness 9 to toughness 8 can be a huge break point for a lot of your weapons, essentially making it so that a lot of your shooting and melee can now be going into those targets with what is essentially +1 to wound. So it can be a huge increase to your potential output, and it can really make it much, much easier for you to shoot enemies off objectives, or just make those really tanky, hard to kill enemy Death Stars a lot more manageable. To help play off this further, you do of course get detachments to help with this, and the index one of the Plague Company ties in very well with Nurgle's Gift. This detachment used to just give you a fairly rubbish rule of essentially sticky objectives. Now it still does this, and basically in your command phase what it does is that if you control an objective and a Death Guard unit is within range of it, you infect it, and it remains under your control even if you then move off it until the enemy obviously controls it. But there is now also an extra bonus to that in that the objective is infected and it generates the Nurgle's Gift aura. So even if an enemy is trying to get near it to steal it, you can potentially try to shoot them away from it a bit more easily too. But that's what came initially. It did get added to in a later balanced data slate, and this now means that when you are at the declare battle formations step of the game, you can pick one of 3 sicknesses, and they also impact enemy units that are within range of your Nurgle's Gift, and all of them are actually fairly nasty. So Skull Squirm Blight makes an enemy unit -1 to their weapon and ballistic skill while they're in contagion range. Rattlejoint Agu reduces their save characteristic by 1, which is incredibly powerful, whilst Scabrous Soul Rot reduces their OC and leadership by 1. So all of these are put onto the enemy in addition to that -1 toughness, and it can mean you can absolutely massively debuff an enemy army in a way that suits you the best. You know, if you really want to up your durability and just make it so the enemy can't kill you, drop their ballistic and weapon skill by 1, or if you just want to make it so that even regular Terminators die as quickly to Marines to bolter fire, then a combination of the army rule and the Rattlejoint Agu will turn that Terminator into a mere toughness 4 3-up save model when they're in contagion range. So there are some very powerful debuffs to put onto the enemy, and it can make it so that when your army is up close and personal, they are either going to find it very, very difficult to hurt you, or just die in droves with the combination of abilities. So I do like this detachment. I think it is really fun and potentially quite potent. You do need to get close to the enemy, of course, but when you do get there, you are going to be bringing some terrifyingly good debuffs to the enemy. For the Plague Company's enhancements, Living Plague is first. This one comes in at 20 points and it can go onto a Death Guard model, and it simply adds 3 inches to their aura abilities, including their Nurgle's Gift. So really handy at just getting those debuffs into the enemy lines much more quickly and much more easily, and of course giving you a huge 12-inch aura on your Nurgle's Gift by battle round 3, so you can be impacting units that you're in combat with, as well as quite possibly other units that are a bit further away that may be trying to head towards an objective or something. So you can really spread that -1 toughness and potentially -1 to their saves against any shooting that you may be throwing into a nearby unit. So it is a really nice combo if you want to get those debuffs active into the enemy as much as you possibly can. Deadly Pathogen is a bit cheaper at 15 points. This one is a simple +1 strength and attacks on the bearer's melee weapons, which is already fairly nice for 15 points, but you get an additional bonus, which is that if you are within range of an infected objective, you instead get +2 to those stats, which can be very potent if you are fighting near an objective. Getting something like a Demon Prince to 8 strength 10 attacks or even 16 strength 8 attacks can be very, very nasty for just boosting their melee output. The Droning is an aura that costs you 10 points, and what this one does is that when an enemy unit is within contagion range of the bearer, if the unit fails a battle shock test, you roll a dice, and on a 2 to 5 they take a mortal wound, or on a 6 it is D3. Now this one is kind of crappy. You need to be in contagion range, and sure, that isn't always too hard, but they then need to fail a battle shock, which is a bit more random, and then you have a dice roll on top of it, and 2/3 of the time it's just going to do a mortal wound. So it really isn't worth it, I don't think, unless you've got nothing to spend your last 10 points on. Finally, the Shamble Rot enhancement is the priciest at 25 points. This one can be brutal. It just forces a flat -2 to charge rolls when the enemy is trying to charge the bearer and his unit, so making a charge out of Deep Strike 11 inches now rather than 9, which is fantastic, but even making those easier, more reliable 3 or 4 inch charges now significantly riskier, and just giving you a bit more breathing room and opportunity for you to be the one charging rather than your opponent. So yes, this one is pricey, but it does give you some great sort of screening and deep strike protection, as well as giving you that advantage in that if you need to get the charge off on a particular unit, this can definitely help you ensure that it does happen rather than the opponent charging you. The 6 stratagems for the Plague Company start with Ferric Blight. This is a shooting or a fight phase stratagem. You get to pick a Death Guard unit from your army, and it gets +1 to their AP for their attacks, which is nice for a cheap little 1 command point. And then if the enemy unit you've targeted is within contagion range of an objective you control, then any critical wounds you score are at -2 instead. So this can potentially lead to a unit being -1 to their save from Nurgle's Gift, and then a bonus -2 AP on top of your guns, meaning a 3-up save Marine would only be saving on a 6-up from a simple bolter. So this can combo really, really well if you get all the stars aligned to bring some massive boosts to your ranged or melee output. Disgustingly Resilient is next. This one is a classic powerful Death Guard rule, now in the form of a stratagem. It is costly at 2 command points, but in the enemy fight phase you can impose a -1 damage debuff on an enemy unit, so making those scary 2 damage power fists now significantly less worrisome into your Plague Marines and Terminators, and just making most of those 2 or 3 damage weapons a lot harder for your opponent to really leverage them to get a load of damage into your guys. So this one is pricey, but it can definitely save a unit against a strong melee threat. The Sanguis Flux is in the fight phase. This is 1 CP. A Death Guard unit can be given sustained hits 1 on their weapons, or sustained hits 2 if they are within range of an infected objective you control. Now, Death Guard don't have the scariest base melee profiles on a lot of their units, but even Plague Marines with their Plague Knives can now be throwing out a solid number of attacks with both lethal and potentially sustained hits too, so they can cut through chaff and vehicles really quite effectively. And on your units that do have those better melee weapons, sustained hits too can be a huge force multiplier to get the most out of them. The Gifts of Decay is also one command point. This one is done in your command phase. It allows you to pick a Death Guard model and they regain D3 wounds or a flat 3 wounds if they're within range of an infected objective you control. So this is pretty damn amazing if a character has been hit by some precision shots or on something like a Demon Prince or even Mortarion. This can get you a good chunk of wounds back on any of those, and it is going to be a really handy strat to play just to let them keep on going and keep on doing their job as the battle rages on. Next up we have Boil Blight. This one is done in your shooting phase. It allows you to pick a Death Guard unit and an enemy unit within contagion range of it, and your weapons get the heavy and ignores cover abilities. So essentially getting you +1 to hit if you've stayed still and further ignoring any defenses from things like cover and the like. So once again, with abilities like the -1 to the enemy save from the Rattle Joint Ague, you can really make even entrenched defensive enemy units die so easily with the firepower that you can put out in combination with this. And then finally we have Cloud of Flies. This is another solid defensive strat. In the enemy shooting phase, you get to pick a Death Guard unit that's been targeted and it gains the stealth ability. So just giving you a further -1 to be hit. And this does of course stack with the -1 ballistic skill from the Skull Squirm Blight if you've chosen that. So it will be reducing a Marine's ballistic skill to 4+, then giving them -1 to hit from stealth. So it could mean that even a Marine will be hitting your guys on 5s. So it's a fairly solid way to just keep a unit alive that you really want to stick around on an objective or as you're moving up the board. On the other side of things, the Flyborn Host was the Grotmus detachment. This one's more infantry focused, and as I said, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but the video is linked below. This one I do like. It gives your infantry the Scout 5-inch rule and also stealth, and it means a foot-slogging Death Guard list can be actually scarily fast up the board and much more difficult to take down as they are getting into position. It's got some really good strats and enhancements too. Plague Vial is an especially good enhancement, making a unit essentially untargetable unless the enemy is within 18 inches of them, which for 25 points is just amazing for objective play, letting your backfield objective holders just be yours and just stay safe all game long without some serious effort from the enemy. And then Droning Chorus, just letting you be even more of a mobile force by giving the bearer and his unit assault. So the 5-inch scout move, an extra d6 inches every movement phase, while still being able to put out all of their firepower, is fairly fantastic for a slow army like the Death Guard. Equally, the strats are fairly solid. Vermin Cloud gets you an always useful 6-inch pile-in or 6-inch consolidate instead of 3 inches, which can be fantastic for grabbing objectives or just tagging another unit in melee. And then you have things like the Mephitic Invigoration, which means an infantry gets a semi-transhuman physiology style rule. It allows an infantry unit within 6 inches of a Mephitic Blight Hauler to reduce incoming shooting attacks wound roll by 1 if the strength of the attack is higher than the unit's toughness. So it is just a very good set of mobility and defensive tools, whilst also giving you a tad more output and reliability when you are locked in combat with things like Eye of the Swarm, for instance, letting you shoot your non-blast weapons as though they were pistols. Overall, I do like both, but I personally prefer the Plague Company. I just think it brings some truly debilitating debuffs to the enemy and has a really strong set of stratagems that I do think pretty much all will come into handy at least a few times throughout most games. But from the detachments and onto the datasheets now. First up, we have the Death Guard Demon Prince. The wingless version costs you a reasonably cheap 160 points, and that gets you a 7-inch move, toughness 11, 10 wounds, and a 2-up save alongside a 4-up invuln, so he is fairly tanky. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a Feel No Pain, but he does give one out in an aura thanks to Grandfather's Blessing, and this impacts any Death Guard infantry units within his contagion range. So they will be getting a somewhat handy 6-up Feel No Pain, and yes, that isn't much, but in concert with some of the other defensive buffs you can have in this army, it can make a lot of your units incredibly difficult to put down. He also gets a Flamer style ranged weapon with his Plague Spewer. This is d6 shots at strength 5, -1 AP, 1 damage, but it does have anti-infantry 2+, so it's actually okay at pushing through a few wounds onto weaker chaff-style infantry, but of course it is in melee where he really shines, with either 6 strength 8 minus 2 AP 3 damage swings, or you can instead sweep with his Hell-Forged weapons for 14 strength 6 0 AP 1 damage swings. Generally, the extra strength and the extra AP make the strike profile better into most things, in my opinion, but if you've got a load of gaunts, for instance, trying to tie you down, that sweep profile will do quite a lot of work, killing about 6 or 7 of them every fight phase. So he's good, but you could instead take the slightly pricier Winged Demon Prince, who comes in at 195 points, so it is a 35 point bump. He does drop to toughness 10, but he does also gain 4 inches of movement, going up to that much nicer 11 inches, and of course gains fly. He's got the same weapons that he can take advantage of, but his abilities are instead Warp Horror, which forces an enemy unit he charges to take a Battle Shock test, so potentially stopping some stratagems being used, but as always is a little bit unreliable. His other ability though is Devastating Assault, and this gives his weapons devastating wounds after he's charged, so this can actually have quite a big impact. Getting those 3 damage swings from the strike profile, potentially ignoring any saves, can make him deadly into Terminators and Custodies, and it even helps him out in a pinch in the sweep profile too, with its complete lack of AP, just to get through any of those 5 or even 6 up saves that a lot of chaff infantry tend to have. If instead you wanted to take something different to a Demon Prince, you could look to the named Chaos Lord of the Death Guard, who is the ever popular Typhus. Typhus is a relatively cheap 80 points, which for his toughness 6, 6 wound, 2 up save, 4 up invuln stat line isn't bad. He is slow with only a 5-inch move, but he can deep strike, which can help get around that quite significantly, and he is a pretty damn scary threat alongside a load of Terminators. He does only have a melee attack, but the Mastercrafted Man Reaper is pretty scary. It either has 5 strength 9 minus 2 AP 3 damage swings, or a sweep profile for 10 at strength 6 minus 1 AP and 1 damage, and of course both options do have lethal hits, so he can cleave through tougher infantry, chaff, even vehicles pretty damn effectively, and he also brings a brilliant defensive buff, especially to a unit of Terminators with the Destroyer Hive, which grants them -1 to be hit in melee. Now it's a shame that isn't ranged as well, but making a big stompy unit of Terminators even tougher to shift in combat is a very welcome boost to them. Now I know I said he's just melee only, but he does have a psychic power in the Eater Plague, and this is done in your shooting phase, so I guess it's kind of a shooting attack. You get to pick an enemy unit within 18 inches and visible, and you roll a d6. On a 1, you take d3 mortals, which is annoying, but on a 2 to 5, the enemy unit takes d6 mortals, or d3 plus 3 on the roll of a 6, so it does add a little bit of a shooting attack to him, and it's actually quite a reliable one. It's essentially hitting on 2+ for d6 mortals, which is honestly not bad. On average, he's going to kill a Terminator every shooting phase, so that can definitely help to thin out a unit before he charges in. So all in all, he's pretty solid for 80 points. He's got good melee punch, he's got some decent ranged, he's got a brilliant defensive buff to add to either the Terminators or the Poxwalkers that he joins. He is just very efficient for his cost. The regular non-named Chaos Lord is a much cheaper 65 points. Now you do lose 1 toughness and 1 wound as well, and also drop from a 2-up save to a 3-up save, but you do keep the same 4-up invuln, which is nice, and you have a much nicer selection of war gear. You can swap out your bolt pistol for a combi bolter, a plasma pistol, or a combi weapon, whilst your chainsword can instead be a plague fist for some scary strength 8 minus 2 AP 2 damage attacks with lethal hits, or something like a more anti-chaff exalted weapon, which brings you 6 strength 5 minus 2 AP 1 damage attacks, also with lethal hits. He can only join Plague Marines, but he does boost their output quite well. He gives them reroll hit rolls of 1, thanks to the Chaos Lord rule, and then Desiccation Conduit is a fairly nice aura which potentially does d3 mortals to an enemy unit within contagion range on a 4+. So if he is stuck in with his squad in melee, they can just do a bit more damage to anything that is in combat with them, which is just a nice little bit extra to bring to a fight. The Lord in Terminator armor, by comparison, he does get the boosted toughness up to 6, and also an extra wound, sporting 6 there as well. He also has a decent selection of melee options. He can take a Plague Fist or an Exalted Weapon, or he can take a Chain Fist or Twin Lightning Claws if you wanted to go pure melee. He also brings some fairly nice bonuses to his unit of Terminators. He gives them the same reroll hit rolls of 1 thanks to being a Chaos Lord, and then he also has the same Desiccation Conduit aura as the regular Lord. So he is essentially the same, he's just a bit tankier. Obviously he goes with your Terminators, and he costs you 85 points instead of 65. Next up though, we have a few unique Death Guard characters. The Lord of Virulence is 80 points and is essentially a Terminator Lord in stat line, toughness 6, 6 wounds, and the usual 2-up, 4-up of a Terminator. He can only take a heavy Plague Fist for melee, but that does give him 5 strength 8, minus 2 AP, 2 damage swings with lethal hits, which is fairly good. And then his gun is the Twin Plague Spewer, which is a D6 shot flamer style gun with twin linked and anti-infantry 2+. So it is going to be almost guaranteed to wound any infantry you shoot at. It is only minus 1 AP and 1 damage, so it's not terrifying, but it is pretty good for clearing out bigger blobs of guardsmen or orc boys relatively well. And then he also allows his unit to re-roll wound rolls with their shooting attacks thanks to Master of Destruction. So of course that doesn't help him because he has twin linked, but it can be a big boost to anything like Blightlord Terminators that he may be with. And then finally, his Blight Bombardment lets you gain Ignores cover on any blast weapons from any Death Guard model that shoots a target visible to the Lord of Virulence. So this isn't just his unit, this is any model in your army can get Ignores cover as long as this guy can see the target. So this can be a great force multiplier for quite a lot of your shooting. Overall, he's fairly solid. He can add some decent output if you've got a more shooty list, and he does do okay in melee too. So adding him and a unit of Terminators, if you want to bring them, can be a good choice. The Lord of Contagion is one of the oldest Death Guard models, one of the oldest new Death Guard models, should I say. I think it came in with the original 8th edition starter set, if I'm correct. But this guy is also 80 points. He is purely melee focused. He's got a Plague Blade, which is either 5 strength 8 minus 2 AP 3 damage swings, or 10 at strength 5 0 AP and 1 damage, both of course with lethal hits. So it's kind of like Typhus. He can do a good bit of work into anything from guardsmen to Terminators, but on top of that he can also give his unit re-rolls in melee, which is fantastic with all the lethal hits you can get in your army, and Terminators certainly will love that for their unit. Also, you get Abundance of Sickness, which means every time he loses a wound in the fight phase, you can roll a dice, and on a 4+, the closest enemy unit in engagement range takes a mortal wound. So he can just kick back a few wounds onto enemies as they fight into him. It's nothing much, but it can help, and he really is, I think, quite a good force multiplier for a unit of fighty Terminators by getting them a load of value from their attacks with lethal hits. If maybe you want some psychic trickery, then the Death Guard also get a Terminator Sorcerer. This guy is 1 less wound than other Terminator Lords, sitting at 5, but he's also a fair bit cheaper at 70 points, and in addition to the ranged weapon options he gets Curse of the Leper, which is a 24-inch strength 6 shot, and it can be either -1 or -2 AP depending on whether you focus it or not, and if you do, it also bumps up from D6 to 2D6 shots. So if you want to risk some mortals, you can make it so you are firing 2d6 strength 6 -2 AP 1 damage shots, which isn't actually awful into chaff units. The Sorcerer also gets the same choice of melee weapons, but with an extra option of a force weapon, which he comes with base, and that brings him 4 strength 6 -1 AP D3 damage attacks, which is okay, but it does get better in a little bit. One of his abilities is Putrescent Vitality, and this allows you to inflict a really solid debuff on the opponent. You get to roll a dice at the start of the fight phase, and on a 1, your unit takes D3 mortals, but on a 2+, the enemy unit is -1 to their damage for the phase, so giving you this fantastically good defensive bonus, which is going to make your Terminators just unbelievably reliable as they go into combat. The other thing about his War Scroll is that he can get +2 to the strength and damage of his psychic weapons once per battle. So this can turn his mediocre Force Sword into an actually really scary strength 8 D3+2 damage weapon, which actually is really good. Or alternatively, because it doesn't say melee only, this could turn your Curse of the Leper into a strength 8 3 damage ranged attack. So it could actually do quite a bit of work into things like Terminators now. One of the other psychic units you have is the Malignant Plaguecaster. This guy is a cheaper still 65 points. He's only got a 3-up save, no invuln, and only 4 wounds, so he is quite a bit squishier. He's also fairly rubbish in melee. His Corrupted Staff just gives him 4 strength 6 -1 AP D3 damage attacks, but he does have the rather nice Plague Wind ranged attack. It is only 12 inches, which is very short range, but it's D6 shots at strength 4 -1 AP D3 damage, or he can focus it to be D6 plus 3 shots at strength 6 -2 AP and D3 damage. It also has Torrent, so it's auto hitting. So he can do a solid bit of anti-infantry work if you need him to, and he can join Plague Marines as well, so this can actually be quite useful if you want to avoid them getting bogged down by enemy chaff. His actual abilities are the Gift of Contagion, and this allows you to debuff an enemy in your shooting phase. You can give them -1 to hit in melee on a 2+. The usual caveat is here, where your unit takes D3 mortals if you roll a 1, but putting that -1 to hit on an enemy can be quite impactful because it lasts until your next shooting phase, so this could cover 2 entire turns worth of melee combat and just keep your Plague Marines alive that much longer. He can also really nicely impose a -2-inch penalty to an enemy's move, advance, and charge rolls with Pestilent Fallout if he causes any wounds against an enemy infantry unit with his Plague Wind. So he can massively debuff an enemy melee unit and make them not only much slower, but also much less scary when they do actually reach combat. So I quite like him. His own output isn't amazing, but he can make a unit of Plague Marines much more resilient and harder for your opponent to take care of. On the topic of who this guy can join, next up we do have the Plague Marines. These guys come in a unit of 5 for 90 points, or a unit of 10 for 180, or you can instead go for the thematic unit of 7 for 125, which does work out as a tiny saving per model, but on the downside you lose some weapon options compared to taking a unit of 10, so it depends if you want more fluff or just more overall value for your points. Either way, it is roughly 18 points for a toughness 5, 3-up save, 2 wound model that comes with a fairly good amount of melee and ranged options. Their Plague Bolt Guns are just normal bolters but with lethal hits, which is actually quite a nice bonus to them, and it's the same as their Plague Knives. Strength 4, 0 AP, 1 damage, but with the lethal hits means they can punch up that little bit better into tougher targets. 1 in 5 can take a Blight Launcher for 2 strength 6 -1 AP 2 damage shots, and then 1 in 5 can take a Plague Spewer for that Flamer style strength 5 -1 AP 1 damage gun with anti-infantry 2+, and then they can also take a choice of a Melter or Plasma gun or a Plague Belcher, which grants you a few more anti-infantry shots, or instead you can kit them out for a more melee role. 2 of them can take Bubotic Weapons, which grants them 4 strength 5 -2 AP 1 damage attacks each, and then 2 can also take a Heavy Plague Weapon, which is a Power Fist style strength 8 -2 AP 2 damage profile. So they are very customizable. They have a great selection of ranged or melee options, and you really can fit out a squad to either do one thing really well or a mix of both, depending on just what you need them for. They also get a bit more reliability on objectives. They get to add 1 to battle shock tests when they are on objectives, so it's not the best rule ever, to be honest, but Remorseless does just make them a tiny bit better when they are sat back on an objective or they're controlling one in the midfield. What is a cheaper infantry option is the Death Guard Cultists. These guys come in a unit of 10 for 50 points or 100 points for 20. They are, as you would expect, pretty flimsy, toughness 3 with a 6-up save, so they are just going to die in droves. They are basically there to hold an objective or act as a screen. They don't have much in the way of output, 2 strength 3 attacks each in melee, and then some token strength 3 shooting with the option for a couple of heavier guns. They can take a grenade launcher or a stubber and that kind of thing, so nothing super scary. They do, however, get a 6-inch scout move, which is quite good for a slow army like the Death Guard. You really can use these guys quite well to screen up some of your more important units, or just to move up to get onto an objective a bit more easily, so it is a handy trick. And they do have a lot of use if you want that cheap throwaway screen. But the big problem with them is that they face some fairly stiff competition from a similarly priced Death Guard specific chaff unit, which is the Poxwalkers. Poxwalkers are also 50 points for 10 or 100 points for 20. They do have a slightly better toughness at toughness 4, but their save is actually worse. It is a 7+, so it won't ever come into play unless they're in cover. But they do make up for that by having a 5-up Feel No Pain, which can actually be quite powerful if the enemy is trying to kill them with a light arms fire. They're worse in melee as well. They've got 2 strength 3 attacks, but they only hit on 5s, so they really aren't going to kill anything. But they can be good roadblocks and objective holders. Their 5-up Feel No Pain will let them stick around for a bit longer than you might think. And they also have their rule Curse of the Walking Pox, and that gives them some handy model regen. Whenever they destroy an enemy model that isn't a monster or a vehicle, they can get a Poxwalker model back. So they really can be quite effective at just slowing down an enemy and making it take a long while for them to whittle their way through them, all the while keeping hold of that important objective for you. So they are similar to the cultists, but they are probably just a little bit better for being that road bump or speed block or just screening unit. But back to another character now. The Noxious Blightbringer is another HQ that can join Plague Marines. He's very cheap at 45 points, and that gets you a toughness 5, 3-up save, 4 wound profile, so fairly generic. He's got a plasma pistol and a cursed plague bell. The bell is 5 attacks that hit on 3s with no rend and 2 damage in lethal hits, so it's a bit of a weird profile. It's not really all that good. The lack of AP on it really does hurt his output, but he brings a very nice set of rules for his cost. Sickening Vitality gives his unit reroll advance and charge rolls, meaning a melee-focused Plague Marine unit can much more reliably get into combat. And then the Bell Tolls means that when an enemy is within contagion range of him, any battle shock or leadership test they take is at -2. So it makes it much easier for his unit to not only get into combat, and then when they are there, making it so that your enemies will fail those tests much more often. It's honestly not awful for 45 points, and in a way, he and the next few units as well, you can kind of consider them as just slightly more expensive enhancements for a unit. They add some mediocre punch on their own usually, but they bring some decent rules that if you don't have the points or you don't want to use points for a specific enhancement, but you want to buff a particular squad, these next few units in the index can actually add an almost enhancement level buff to a unit. So likewise, we get the Foul Blightspawn. He's another Lieutenant style character that can be joined to Plague Marines. He's a bit pricier at 60 points, but he does have that same toughness 5, 3-up save, 4 wound profile, and again, some pretty awful melee with 4 strength, 4 swings. His ranged attacks are a bit better though. He's got a Plague Sprayer. So it's again some flamer goodness, strength 7, -2 AP and 2 damage with anti-infantry 2+, and that means he can do quite a bit of work into Marines, and on average he will kill 1 or 2 Marines in the shooting phase, which is quite a handy addition to a unit, especially for his low cost. The buff he brings though is that he gives the unit he is with fights first. So this is of course exceptionally good, and if you load a unit to be strong in combat, whilst he isn't going to add much himself, he is going to make it so that the enemy gets hit really hard by your squad before they get to swing. So he is definitely a bit more of an investment at 60 points, but if you want that melee unit of Plague Marines, he can be a very powerful addition to them. At a cheaper 50 points, the Biologus Putrefier is yet again another character in the same vein as the previous two. Cheap, not so scary on his own, but does bring some fairly tasty buffs. he can join Plague Marines only, and once again, for his own output, he's got Plague Knives, so 4 strength 4 lethal hit attacks, nothing super amazing. At range, he's actually okay. He's got Hyper Blight Grenades, which are d6 shots at strength 5, minus 1 AP, 2 damage, and lethal hits and blast, so fairly good into bigger enemy units. And then he also has one more pistol attack for when he's locked up in combat, which is strength 4 but is a whopping 3 damage, so can actually surprise an enemy and maybe, if you're lucky, kill off a Terminator. What he allows a unit to do is that once per battle round, they can use the grenade stratagem for 0 CP. This is terrifyingly good, and it can get you a load of mortal wound output on a unit of Plague Marines. So that does make up a good chunk of his points right there, I think. But on top of that, he also gives his unit lethal hits, which is okay. The downside of it is that a lot of Plague Marine weapons do already have lethal hits, but he also gives the unit crits on 5s. So those auto wounds will now be going off on 5s rather than 6s. So that is quite a big benefit. A unit of 10 Plague Marines with, say, 2 Melter Guns to get the lethal hits on them and also auto wounding on 5s is really very good. He is quite a solid pick for 50 points. Getting those better crits, getting the free grenade strat, both of those are very, very strong. So I think he's very, very good to add to a unit of Plague Marines, but he isn't the last of these cheaper lieutenant style units because there is yet more. And next up we have the Tallyman. The Tallyman is 45 points. Toughness 5, 3 up save, 4 wounds, and he can of course join Plague Marines. He's got a slightly juiced up plasma pistol, which is the same stats but sustained hits D3, so it can do a bit more work than you might expect sometimes. But for 45 points, he grants you a little bit of potential command point regeneration. In your command phase, you get to roll 2d6, and on a 7+, you gain a command point. The average on 2d6 is 7, so this isn't as bad as it may seem. You will on average at least get a couple of command points over the course of the game. And then he also brings his unit +1 to hit. That is very good. And with some of the other characters that can join the same unit that bring rerolls, such as the Chaos Lord, hitting on 2s with full rerolls essentially is very, very strong on a unit of Plague Marines. That can get you a significant amount of damage into enemy units for not an unreasonable cost. The last of these cheaper HQs is the Plague Surgeon. I really like this one. He is 50 points, so again, relatively cheap. He's got some okay melee. The Bale Sword is 4 strength 5, -2 AP, 2 damage swings with lethal hits, so not awful at killing Marines, but his bonuses are very good. He can heal a Death Guard infantry character for 3 health at the end of your movement phase, so any precision shots that have hit a character in a unit with him, or any characters that are nearby to him, he can heal them back up. But then his Tainted Narthecium, that allows him to restore a destroyed bodyguard model in his unit in your command phase. So bearing in mind he's 50 points and a Plague Marine is around 17 or 18, that means in 3 battle rounds he will have made his points back just from returning models, which makes him exceptionally cost effective before you even consider any healing he can do and also his own melee output. He is just a very, very good pick to add to an objective holding unit to make them even more durable and even more difficult to push off an objective. Following those, we're now on to the 2 unique Death Guard Terminator units. First up is the Blight Lords. These guys come in a unit of 5 or 10 at either 155 or 310 points, so an actually not unreasonable 31 points per model. They are toughness 6, so they are slightly tankier than other Terminators, and they do of course have that same 2-up save, 3 wounds, and 4-up invuln. They do get Deep Strike, which helps a lot with their terrible 4-inch move, so you really can get them where you need them in the game. And they come with the rule Blistering Fusillade, which allows them to re-roll wound rolls of 1 with their shooting attacks. So they are definitely a bit better at ranged. They do also have a fairly good selection of weapons with things like the Reaper autocannon and combi weapons, and also a Blight Launcher, or their version of the Heavy Flamer in the Plague Spewer. So they are more of a ranged unit, I would say. That's not to say they are bad in melee though. Each of them has got a Bubotic Blade, which brings them 4 strength 5, -2 AP, 1 damage attacks with the lethal hits, and then 1 in 5 can take a Flail of Corruption for 6 strength 5, -1 AP, 2 damage swings. So it's nothing super scary, but they really can cut through infantry reasonably well when they do get into combat. If you want a more pure melee option though, that is the Death Shroud Terminators. These guys come in a unit of 3 or 6. They are pricier at 110 points or 220 for 6, so they're around 36 points per model. They do have the same toughness 6, 2-up save, 4-up invuln, and 3 wounds, but then they bring a semi-transhuman physiology style rule with their Silent Bodyguard, and this gives enemy attacks -1 to wound rolls if the strength is higher than the unit's toughness, as long as your Death Shroud have a character with them. So they do make quite a scary bodyguard unit, and they can make even relatively scary anti-tank weaponry wound on 3s or even 4s into them, so it does help them stick around as they go into combat. They do have some shooting. They each have a Plague Spurt Gauntlet, which gives them a 12-inch range flamer. It's D6 shots at strength 3, 0 AP, and 1 damage. It does, however, have anti-infantry 4+, and is a pistol, so they can be shot in melee, which is nice, and it does make these guys just even more incentivized to go into combat, because their main melee attack is their Man Reapers, and these have got either 4 strength 8, -2 AP, 2 damage swings with lethal hits, or the sweep profile, which is still lethals, but 6 strength 5, 0 AP, and 1 damage. So a full unit can do a hell of a lot of work. They can easily wipe out an entire 10-man Marine squad in a single combat with the strike profile, but equally, they can do a fair bit of work into even lighter vehicles thanks to that 2 damage and those lethal hits. So they are just a great unit to put a character in and then just move them up or deep strike them in, threaten the midfield, and they go and hunt down any enemy scary threats that are in your way. The next few units we'll go through quite quickly. These are some generic Chaos style units. The Hellbrute is up first, 130 points. It is toughness 9, 8 wounds with a 2-up save, as you would expect. It's got the regular selection of pretty good melee and ranged weapons. You can go fully melee with a choice of fists, hammers, or scourges, or instead you can sit back if you want and take a twin las cannon, a twin auto cannon, plasma cannon, heavy bolter, or something like that in addition to the missile launcher. And the rules for this thing are infused with the blessings of Nurgle. This puts a debuff on an enemy that it hits in shooting or melee, and that unit is then considered to be in contagion range until the start of your next turn. So this can essentially impose a possible -1 toughness and -1 armor save on an enemy unit for any follow-up attacks into it. It's honestly quite a fantastic debuff to put onto an enemy if you've got more shooting or some melee to go into it. And then it also has the Enraged Impact rule, which just does D3 mortals on an enemy unit on a 2+ after the Hellbrute charges. So it is a pretty good all-rounder. It's quite a nice thing to bring just to add either more ranged or just as another melee threat to chuck into close combat with the enemy. Chaos Spawn are Chaos Spawn. 2 in a unit, they've got an 8-inch move, they're toughness 5, 4 wounds with a 4-up save. They do also have a bonus 5-up Feel No Pain, and at 70 points, they're really not a bad distraction. That is just 35 points each. They really can stick around as a tar pit pretty damn well, especially because they also regain D3 wounds in each player's command phase, so they are quite hard to get rid of unless you get rid of them in one go. And then whilst they are tying down the enemy, they are throwing out 2d6 plus 4 strength 5 -1 AP 2 damage swings from the unit, so actually they can do quite a lot of hurt in combat to things like Marines and other light infantry. So if you've got points and you want like a relatively fast moving screen or just something to tie down enemy ranged units, Chaos Spawn are actually fairly good at that. On to some more unique Death Guard vehicles now. First up we have the Myphitic Blight Haulers. These are cute little mini tanks costing you 90 points each, and they come in a unit of 1 to 3. So you can take 3 to get you a fairly nice unit. It's got a chunky 10-inch move, toughness 9, 3-up save, and 5-up invuln. And with 10 wounds each, that unit could have 30 wounds in total, which will be very, very difficult for your opponent to shift. They are decidedly okay in melee with 4 strength 6 attacks each, but in shooting, each one has a missile launcher, a multi-melter, and also some token shots from their Bile Spurt. And with a great rule of tank hunters, the unit can get +1 to wound rolls against vehicle units. So that is essentially 2 strength 9 -4 AP d6 damage shots, and 1 extra strength 9 minus 2 AP d6 damage shot, all with +1 to wound. So they can actually punch into even tougher vehicles relatively okay, but all those toughness 9 vehicles around the board, they will be wounding on 3s. So they really can just demolish lighter tanks and transports very, very quickly if your opponent isn't prepared for them. There's also a slightly more melee focused unit, which is the Fetid Bloat Drones. They only come in a unit of 1, but at 90 points they can be relatively easy to fit into most lists. They've got the same 10-inch move, toughness 9, 3-up save, 5-up invuln, and 10 wounds, so they are relatively durable, and Hovering Death allows it to shoot and charge after it's fallen back. To me, it's more of a melee design. You can take a Heavy Blight Launcher, which gives you 6 strength 8 minus 2 AP, 2 damage shots, which certainly isn't bad, or a Plague Spitter for that Heavy Flamer style option, but I personally would probably always take the Flesh Mower and the Plague Probe option. And what that does is it nets you 3 strength 6 minus 1 AP 1 damage attack, but then also 10 strength 7 minus 1 AP 2 damage attacks, all with a lethal hit, which is a seriously impressive potential output, and it can quite literally mow through anything from chaff to tougher infantry to marines and terminators just through sheer weight of dice. So it's a really fun, really annoying, fast moving, screen clearing unit that is actually quite effective in an army like the Death Guard. And then we've got one of the coolest units that the Death Guard have, which is their artillery piece, the Plague Burst Crawler. This is expensive at 180 points, but with toughness 10, 12 wounds, a 2-up save, and a 5-up invuln, it really is going to stick around for a good long time. This thing allows you to impose a battle shock test on an enemy infantry unit you hit with a shooting attack from its Plague Burst Mortar. It's not really the best ability to have, it is rather unreliable, so this is a bit of a shame. And then whilst the guns on it look scary, it isn't actually all that amazing, I don't think. It suffers a lot from the changes to indirect fire that have happened over 10th edition, and it just doesn't do as much as you would want it to. The 2 entropy cannons it comes with do give it some fairly nice strength 10, minus 3 AP, d6 plus 1 damage las cannon style shots, and it does also have a heavy slugger, which is essentially a heavy stubber that can be swapped out for a rot hail volley gun, which is less shots and no AP, but it does have lethal hits and also more shots when it's within 12 inches. But the main gun of this is the mortar, and it's got a whopping 48-inch range, and it does d6 plus 3 indirect fire shots with blast and a lethal hit, and it is strength 8, minus 1 AP and 2 damage. Now, indirect fire can be handy, although it does of course make you hit on 4s, and only being minus 1 AP does just hurt sometimes. It can be amazing, don't get me wrong, into big blobs of gaunts or orc boys thanks to blast, but even when you are not using indirect fire on this, so you will be hitting on 3s, you are still only going to be killing about 2 marines on average with the mortar, so it just feels to me like quite a lot of points and not a huge amount of output. So I really don't think it is as amazing as it looks. Certainly I think the mortar should do a bit more than like it looks like it should. Carrying on now with some of the other older Chaos vehicles, you can take a Land Raider for 240 points, toughness 12, 16 wounds and a 2-up save, so this can be a brilliant way to load some Terminators up into it, get them moving up the board much faster, having a 10-inch move, disembarking them, and then still being able to attempt to charge thanks to the assault ramp, as well as bring some actually okay firepower from its 2 Soul Shatter las cannons, which combined get you 4 strength 12, minus 3 AP, d6 plus 1 damage shots. Likewise, you get the options of the Predator Annihilator and the Predator Destruction. They are both here too. The Annihilator is your anti-armor option with a twin Predator las cannon and 2 Sponson las cannons. It gets you 2 strength 12 shots and 1 at strength 14 with twin linked. It can do quite a bit of work into enemy vehicles and armor thanks to re-rolling damage rolls into monsters and vehicles. The Destructor variant is instead anti-infantry. It brings the Predator Autocannon, which gets you 4 strength 9, minus 1 AP, 3 damage shots, and it gets boosted up to minus 2 AP against infantry. So both of these are actually okay. They do both cost 130 points, so if you do want some more dedicated anti-armor or anti-infantry shooting in your lists, these could be a good shout. Although personally, I'm still not entirely sure it wouldn't be better, not to mention more thematic, to just look towards the Blight Haulers or the Bloat Drones for that cheaper, more spammable, more thematic option. The big old Stompy Defiler also makes an appearance for the Death Guard. At 190 points, it is expensive, but it does have a fairly good Toughness 10 profile with 14 wounds, a 3-up save, and a 5-up invuln, so it will stick around for a little while. Like the World Eaters version, it can move over friendly monster and vehicle units and terrain features that are 4 inches or less, so it just helps it get around the board a bit more reliably and less prone to being stuck somewhere it can't move out from. And then with d6 plus 3 strength 10 3 damage shots from the Defiler cannon, backed up by a terrifying 5 strength 16 minus 3 AP d6 plus 1 damage attacks in melee from the claws, it can actually do quite a bit of work at both ranged and in combat. And what I really like about the Defiler on a personal level is that I think it's really easy to make it into this disgusting Nurgle-inspired version of it that does just look fantastic on the battlefield. So I do like it. It's maybe not the most competitive option at nearly 200 points, but it is relatively durable, it's reasonably fast, and it is okay in both melee and at range. Finally, we get to the regular Chaos Marine version of the Rhino. I actually love this for the Death Guard. A Rhino and 7 Plague Marines were a staple in every single list I ever built back in the days of, I think, 4th or 5th edition. Now, I didn't play in those editions, but I just read a lot of forums and I built lists pretty much all the time. That's all I did in my spare time, was just read forums, read about the rules, and build lists. So I love the idea of having an army that was just loads of 7-man Plague Marine units in a Rhino each, and then like a Demon Prince leading them. It just felt really cool for me. So I love Rhinos. They are good. They bring some very welcome mobility to your army. They help to keep you a bit safer from some of those scarier anti-tank weapons that can threaten your units. And I think at 75 points, they can just be a very good investment if you want that much better 12-inch move to get your slower infantry onto objectives. On to Mortarion now. The Primarch he's actually not super expensive. He's 300 points, and whilst he doesn't get Lone Operative like the Loyalist Primarchs, he is still Toughness 12, 16 wounds, and has a 2-up armor save, 4-up invuln, and a 5-up Feel No Pain. So he is still very, very difficult to put down. He's got some okay shooting. Rotwind brings you d6 plus 3 blast attacks, which are strength 7, minus 2 AP and 1 damage, and do have devastating wounds and lethal hits. So it can actually kill off quite a lot if you roll well. And then he's got his pistol, which is the Lantern. This is only 1 shot, but it is sustained hits d3. So it could be up to 4 hits, and at strength 9, minus 3 AP and 3 damage, it is fairly strong. It's not always going to do much, but if you spike it, you could kill 4 Terminators in a single shot. His Scythe Silence does make him better in melee, of course. That grants him 5 strength 14, minus 3 AP, 4 damage swings, or instead 15 strength 7, minus 1 AP, 1 damage swings, once again, all with a lethal hit. So it is a fairly scary output. He can just wipe out massive units of chaff in one go, or put some massive hurt up to 20 damage into something like an Imperial Knight, and on average he will do about 12 wounds to an Imperial Knight, so he won't one-shot it, but anything up to a Gladiator Lancer or those medium to heavy monsters and vehicles, he can quite reliably wipe them out in a single go. On top of that, he does also get the usual choice of 3 abilities to pick at the start of the battle round. The Host of Plagues allows him to pick Miasma of Pestilence to bring a 6-inch aura of cover against ranged attacks, which makes him and anything around him much more durable against any shots with any AP coming their way. Diseased Influence instead gives a 6-inch aura of reroll wound rolls of 1, so just making you that bit more damaging with your shooting and then also with your melee when you do finally charge in. And then Toxic Presence, that instead gives all Death Guard units within 12 inches of Mortarion an extra 3 inches on their own contagion range. So you can massively spread out those debuffs, potentially getting it to 24 inches across the board if you have a unit about 12 inches away from Mortarion in the 3rd battle round with that buff up. So it is just a really strong set of 3 abilities you can choose from. They really allow you to pick to be either more durable, more killy, or just spreading this army-wide buff across pretty much the entire enemy army. He's also got the Lord of the Death Guard rule, which is another aura. This one allows Death Guard units within 6 inches of him to ignore modifiers to characteristics except for save rolls. So anything that impacts your OC, your movement, your toughness, anything like that, he can just let them ignore it. So it does also bring some great reliability to your units, and against some armies that have those debuffs and abilities to slow you down or make you less durable or make you worse at holding objectives, you are just going to be much better into them. So he is really quite good. He can be shot down, of course, thanks to no lone operative, but I do think he is durable enough. He's quite killy in melee, he's got some okay shooting, and his aura buffs are incredibly strong. So I think he's a really great pick, and I definitely think at 300 points, he's very much worth bringing. The last 2 units in the Death Guard index are the Death Guard Icon Bearer. He's a toughness 5, 4 wound, 3 up save unit that can join Plague Marines. For 45 points, he brings them +1 OC, and also a once per battle at the end of your movement phase ability to extend their contagion range to 12 inches. So if you just need to get a bit further to catch an enemy in contagion range, he can do that. He doesn't do much else, so I'm not sure how worth it he is, but if you think that once per game buff will come in handy, or you just want that extra OC on a unit to make sure you keep that objective in a game, he could be worth throwing in. And then we have the Miasmic Malignifier. I remember doing a video on this all the way back when my channel first started and it was a new unit, or there was at least some new rules for it coming out. And I have a distinct memory of doing that video. But anyway, this thing is 115 points. So already it's fairly pricey. What that gets you is a toughness 10, 12 wound, 3 up save unit. It can't move, but it does give a unit -1 to be hit if it's within 6 inches of it. So having it near an objective you want to camp, or just keep near a long range unit you want to stay safe, it can be a nice little buffer to them. It also brings some diseased cover, which basically grants cover to a unit that's been targeted and isn't fully visible to the enemy because of the Malignifier. So you could potentially place this quite aggressively in your deployment and just use it as an anchor point so that when you are moving up past it and moving into the midfield, you are going to be having units that are -1 to be hit and getting cover as you move up through a choke point or as I said, into the midfield to get some of those objectives. So if that is useful to you, then go for it. This could be beneficial. I'm just not personally sure it's worth 115 points to do that. So I think it's potentially okay. Some armies will really like those 2 buffs on your units for survivability, but I just don't know if it's worth it. And that is the Death Guard. As always, I'd love to know what you make of their index and what you think they might get in terms of detachments in their eventual codex. Do let me know all of your thoughts and theories and ideas down in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.